And I think, Kirsty, to your point, like the key thing to remember is that consistency builds memory structures, right? But the context drives the action. So you have to use out of home to build that memory structure consistently for someone to remember what it was that they saw, and then use the digital space to drive that context home so that they take an action.
Welcome back to the Beyond the Billboard podcast. And if you haven't yet, please do subscribe. We have an exciting announcement to make. Our website is now live. Please go check it out at beyondthebillboard.co.za. Today, we're going to be talking about the bridging of the worlds, the power of out-of-home, digital media, and social media working together. And the digital and marketing expert that we have joining us today is Nivasha Pillay, who is currently the head of digital marketing at MultiChoice Group and a board member of Marketing and Media Alliance Middle East Africa. Nivasha has also held previously senior leadership roles at agencies. Nivasha is going to share her perspective and her knowledge with us about how out-of-home and digital work together at supporting and uplifting one another. Hi, Niv. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for having me today.
We're so excited to get into this conversation about the power of these mediums and how they work together and how they can really amplify each other and support one another. Given your experience at some of these large media agencies in really senior roles, you would have experienced these large global brands that have these mandates about the percentage of spend that has to go to digital media, particularly these global brands, the 60, the 70% of media spends that need to be going to digital media. And we really are living and working in a digital media first approach when it comes to our media strategies and the media approaches. So what I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you believe is the unique role that out-of-home plays in this digital media first ecosystem? We know that out-of-home holds its own when it comes to fame and impact, but I would love to hear your opinion and your perspective, given your experience, about what is the unique role that out-of-home can play in this digital media first ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kirst. I think for me, the key thing to remember is that we're not working in a channel first environment anymore. We're working in an attention first world. And the role that out of home plays in what we do from a digital perspective is out of home gives us the scale and the credibility that we need in order to sell at a digital level. And what I've realized is that out of home and digital work really, really nicely together because digital marketing gives you that precision and personalization to reach specific audiences in specific settings and environments. Whereas without the out of home scale and presence, we're reaching just mass market people continuously at scale, right? So I think one of the key things that I constantly have conversations around is, does it make sense to spam the same person 6 times at a frequency of 5 every single week to get them to buy something? Or do I land a message which out of home can deliver in a much more immersive, experiential way that digital can't land for a consumer? And I think if you think about it, the brands that really, really get this right are the brands that don't look at everything from a channel perspective, but they look at it from how do we grab attention and then how do we keep that attention and demand going.
And it's not just about having the biggest board anymore. It's about making sure that you're landing the message in the correct way to the right audiences and tapping into that human insight so that you can create that reaction.
Yeah. And I think it's important that people start realizing that it's not necessarily just the commercial impact. I think when most people look at it, they look at out of home and they go, wow, that's expensive. Let me rather take that money and put it into digital marketing and I get the same scale at a greater percentage. I think what they forget is that out of home creates the memory structure because once you see something visually, you can't unsee it. Whereas in a digital environment, the attention is 5 seconds, right? So a lot of the time we glance over the stuff that we're seeing because we're seeing so much one after the other. Whereas out of home, you've got that real world presence and it's unavoidable messaging because when you're driving, you're in a state of, hey, I can only see what's in front of me. You're not thinking about 7 other things. Whereas when you're sitting on your phone, you're scrolling with the intention of looking at everything. I think we need to stop looking at things in isolation and looking at it from a channel point of view and start saying, how do these work together to get me the impact that I'm looking for?
You've unpacked so much there that I actually, there's so many different avenues that I want to actually double click on. And I love that you had that conversation almost that we've had so many with so many different clients who are looking to invest in out of home but find it too expensive. And I think coupled with I could probably reach more people using social or digital is often the measurement piece, right? So how are you going to measure the social or the digital performance? There are an array of reporting options available to you versus in out of home. There are some metrics that are available, and depending, which sites you're booking in which environments, there are some metrics, but we know that out of home currently cannot compete directly with the reporting and the ROI, the proof of the ROI from a media spend perspective. And I think that often swings the budget the other way, is that, the feeling for digital and social is you can be more targeted, be more precise, you can target cheaper, and then you can get accurate reporting. But like you've mentioned, you're missing those memory structures that are built using out of home. We know that out of home is a huge trust building format too. So you've got this trust impact. We know that, like it or not, when you see a brand on a billboard, you feel like that brand must have money to invest. You trust them. It creates this whole other structure from a media perspective that feeds into the attention that you spoke about. So I think that I love how you've unpacked how the channels work well together. I also love how you started off this episode by saying to us is that it's actually about attention and it's not about the media channel. And I think that sometimes we get tunnel vision in, we work in the out of home medium. Out of home works well with radio. It works well with social, but we actually need to move away from the channel and more look at what is the brand trying to achieve and how can they reach their audience as effectively as possible, grab their attention. So I love how we've kind of unpacked quite a lot of things up front in this episode. It leads me to the question I wanted to ask you was, how have you seen brands do this well, this bridging between digital, social, and out of home? And what should brands be looking for when they're planning to create this bridge? What should they be doing in the planning phase up front?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you said so much there, Liv. And I think there's so much that I want to unpack. But I think for me, it's important about framing what each avenue does and why it works so well together, right? So I personally believe that out of home is great at creating memory structures, right? It creates that real world presence. Digital then helps us to capture the intent and reach the right people and pique that curiosity, right? Because people that are in that environment across search and programmatic channels, for example, they're looking for something, right? They're not sure what they're looking for, but they're looking, which means that there is intention to purchase. And I think what social does is social really helps to drive that cultural velocity. And I think that's where I've seen some of the best brands get it right, is when they take the three together and they say, okay, how do I create the intent? How do I create the memory structure? And then how do I take that and turn it into a culture? If I had to give you an example, I think Coke does this really, really well with their Share Coke campaign, right? And they've taken that memory structure and they've built it into everything. So if you see an out of home billboard of two cans knocking together and saying share Coke, you're creating the association that Coke brings people together, right? And if you look at how they roll out and execute their digital marketing, they're very, very intentional around what they say. Everything references back to the sharing, bringing people together. And I think it's so important that you craft for this particular formats that you're building
Mm.
for. So out of home might be this one impactful image, but then digital gets to unpack that. And social helps us drive the cultural relevancy by speaking to the norms and the behaviors of the audiences that we're going after. So I think for me, it's like out of home really sparks the curiosity in the moment. Digital's capturing the demand for you. And then social is multiplying the meaning behind what you're trying to do. So I think like I was saying, when you think about an environment where we're going attention first and not channel first, um, across the industry, and I see this across the agencies and the clients that I've had the pleasure of working on. I think one thing that we all get really wrong is we have specialists that look at things at a channel level, but we don't look at what is the common behaviors between stuff, right? So if I had to think about it, like, we always go that, oh, out of home is so unmeasurable. Actually, out of home is so measurable. We just need to understand what are the different touch points, right? I think where agencies and clients get it wrong is we try and quantify everything into a cost per thousand reach. And what we end up seeing is that cost per thousand reach isn't a measure that can go across all channels, because something might be more cost effective in a digital environment versus in an out of home space. Um, and I think something that I was saying the other day, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and I was saying we need to start speaking about outcomes and less about the theory, right? So if we had to look at out of home specifically and how we drive digital impact against out of home, we need to start moving beyond the metrics that are right in front of us. So everyone automatically goes, oh, okay, we can measure it against reach and frequency. But what we actually need to look at is it driving increased search lift? Because when you're in an out of home environment and a space, the natural instinct is to go into search and search for what I was looking for. One of the things that we've been seeing rising quite substantially is social search. And when you start analyzing from a social listening point of view and you start seeing what are the topics and the conversations, a lot of these conversations are being started because of what is happening in an out of home environment. But because we don't measure out of home at a geographical level, we always look at it like, okay, I've got a holding of 60 placements. Let's talk about all of it. We never ever hone in on a conversation in a particular area. So I think something that I did recently is I had a conversation with someone and I said, instead of trying to say, oh, okay, my out of home's not doing anything with me, be more intentional and targeted about your out of home. And then really lean into your social listening in that space to see whether you saw an uplift. And I think when we start looking at things like search lift, your
Mm,
cost per acquisition reductions in those particular areas or geographical spaces, you start really seeing that out of home shouldn't be measured in isolation. It can be measured against digital. I think it's just the way that we talk about measurement is incorrect. We're always trying to quantify it against a metric that exists in the digital space, but we forget that there's other avenues that help drive digital adoption.
mm.
Nev, I could just hug you actually, because I love how you've unpacked that. And I think that, what kind of is just lifting for me is that there's this constant need for the out of home channel to compete and take budget from digital. This is the narrative that we kind of operate in, I guess, in any media channel. You want to see who is taking our budgets. The budgets are going to digital. Therefore, we need to attack and take it from digital. But I love how you frame that in that digital is a different channel to out of home. They complement each other. There's a bridge that can exist between the two. They can work together, just how out of home works well with radio. There shouldn't be this fight between the channels, because what you're missing is that the channels are different and can be measured differently. So as you've said now, out of home doesn't need to be measured against exactly the same metrics that digital is measured against. There are some similarities that exist between the two, but just because you can't measure them in the same way doesn't devalue what out of home offers within the media mix and what it can offer with grabbing this attention. If you're shaping your campaign around how we're going to be catching as many people in our target audience's attention, that's what we're trying to do. So I really love how you've painted that picture so beautifully around how the channels are not fighting against each other. I also like how you've said we need to look at the outcomes and what we're reporting on. We had a fantastic episode with Andrew Brunton from Billups, the head of Billups for EMEA, and he touched on how we spend so much time doing the planning of a campaign and so little of the reporting. And it really stayed with me in that in the beginning, in the briefing phase, we should be talking about how and what are we going to be reporting on. You've given us so many nuggets around looking at search on social. What is being searched there? Looking at traffic in your search can be a result from the out-of-home campaign. And again, I love how you've looped it into being intentional and specific with your out-of-home. We have seen so many successful campaigns and brands that have stand out in out-of-home. They're known for out-of-home in the industry because of this intention. And I think it links back to, like, if you're searching for your ROI in out-of-home, then can you layer some intentional targeting and then look for the social search in those specific areas and the social listening? So I really love how you've shown how the measurement piece comes together so nicely with digital, and that it doesn't have to be exactly the same as what you're reporting on digital. It's a different channel. So I really love how you've painted that picture for us.
Yeah. And I think it's also important that brands stop just looking at the audience as a broad audience, right? When you start looking at your messaging in terms of your first party data audience set and how they engage with your brand, it's very different, right? Then out of home starts telling a very different story. And it's more about how that out of home helped drive bold, unstoppable, simplified messaging for their first party audiences. Um, and I think, like, I've seen some brands do this really, really well, where they use geo-targeting triggers against programmatic digital out of home to create newer audiences to interact with in a digital environment and space. And when you see those working together, you start seeing how the social starts driving that interactive human behavior for us. Digital starts then driving clearer call to actions, but the intent came from the out of home, which was so powerful in driving an experience that you wanted to see more about it. And I think the key thing to remember is that consistency builds memory structures, right? But the context drives the action. So you have to use out of home to build that memory structure consistently for someone to remember what it was that they saw, and then use the digital space to drive that context home so that they take an action. But if I think about it, and I think about the attention span of the audiences that we're going after, if we had to look at a Gen Z, for example, to get a Gen Z's attention, you have to be so out there, so bold, so brave. And if you think about the brands that are really winning them over, it's brands like Canva, for example. I think it was around Christmas time, Canva ran this really amazing out of home campaign where all that the ad said was this was meant to be a 9 by 16, but sized it wrong. And it and
It was so brilliant.
it
Yeah,
was
we'll
so
link the campaign in the episode.
Yes, it was so clever in terms of what it drove, because it told you exactly what the ad does. And then they had this entire social campaign where they just had all of the creators on their platforms bloopers showing. But it created that resonance that, okay, it's okay if you got it wrong, we can fix it for you in a minute, right? And I think it was so intentional because the out of home landed the memory structure that, oh, there's this platform called Canva. And then their digital activity was so specific about driving the call to action home. And then the social relevancy came in because they created a culture around it. And they were like, it's okay if you got it wrong. You don't have to redo it again. Just download Canva and you can do what you need to do. And I think it's that type of behavior that we need to start thinking about, is that everything cannot consistently rely on digital to land the message, because it's a very cluttered environment and a very cluttered space.
From Sunrise in Josie to lights that never sleep, we are Network X outdoor media specialists.
With over 1,000 media platforms across Gauteng, we don't just place ads.
We capture audiences right where life happens.
From premium digital displays to iconic city views,
We turn attention into impact every single day.
so join the experience. Network X out of home.
Yeah, Nav, I love those examples you've unpacked. The Canva one is absolutely brilliant. And it made me think that, we really are seeing this intention in out of home playing out so well globally, locally. There's definitely a change in the market from kind of taking the print ad and pasting it on the billboard. You know what I mean? That was happening a lot more frequently, locally and globally. Yes, it does still happen now, but there's definitely been a major shift in the out of home industry in the past few years around really going that step beyond, seeing how can we make out of home stand out in a different way. Something that I've seen a lot of brands doing, and Calvin Collet, who is the CEO and founder of Melon Mobile, who was in our previous episode, he touched on this, is that a lot of brands are playing in out of home that don't necessarily have the biggest budgets. They're not able to compete with some of the big major brands that play in the industry. So what they're doing is saying, we want to be in out of home. We want it to be a key channel in our media mix, but we're going to be incredibly intentional with it. And even if, for example, we're only booking 5 billboards, but we're competing with some of the biggest categories in out of home, we're going to be so intentional and so specific, and we're going to link to social with our 5 billboards. The intention is for people to pick it up on social and for it to go viral, or to be picked up on LinkedIn, or to be chatted around, like you say, have the Gen Z sharing it amongst themselves. In order to do that, it has to be intentional, it has to be funny, it has to resonate with the audience, all of the things that you've touched on. And I think that it's a great way to see how more brands are entering out of home. And it's almost like, it feels like there's a nod to each other to be like, okay, how am I going to compete with the brands that are more prevalent in this category? And I'm going to have to be smart about it. And being smart is not taking the print ad. So I think it's making everybody be more creative. It's making everybody kind of take a step up. And the question I wanted to ask you was around creativity between the different formats, right? So in that same episode with Melon Mobile, we spoke a lot around digital out of home. And there was a discussion around, how does digital out of home complement or work well with traditional out of home? And I made the point around having different messaging for digital out of home versus static. So what you'd put on your static billboard, what you put on digital out of home should complement it, but should communicate something slightly different because of the nature of digital out of home. And from your opinion, what would you advise brands to do around shaping their creative for digital versus out of home? How should they differ? How should they be similar? And how can they get the best from the creative executions with bridging this gap between online and offline, but also having a complementary, cohesive campaign message?
So I'm going to keep it very simple, right? Stick to what your truth is. Stop trying to do everything. I think where people really go wrong with their out of home messaging is they try and compete with the bigger brands and they lose, in essence, what their brand truth is. If you focus in and double down on what it is you're trying to say, it's a lot more intentional in terms of landing a message, right? I give you a practical example about this is Adidas don't say Adidas on every single banner. They use their 3 stripes. That sells their brand to them, right? But then they use their digital media to craft the story behind it. So if you think about their latest campaign that launched for their Superstar range, their billboards don't say Adidas, it says Superstar, right? But then they've curated their content in the digital space to tell you that immersive superstar story. And I think
Mm.
that's the key thing, is that hold firm on what your brand truth is. Stop saying, oh, I need to be intentionally funnier. I think a lot of the time I sit around a boardroom table and people are like, oh, we need to be as funny as Nando's, or oh, we need to be as silly as Chicken Licken, or we have to be as bold as and daring as Coke is. And if you look at the brands that really get it, is they hold very truthful to their brand purpose. So I think I saw in the last week Lego do this really, really well with their FIFA World Cup campaign. And they utilize, like, everybody's so zoned in on the players and the focus. And they brought it back to the fact that Lego is not for the players, it's for the person, it's for the end consumer. And they made the entire campaign around the consumer, and it just resonates so much better because they haven't lost focus of what it is that they're trying to sell. So they're still grabbing the attention using their celebrities, but they're bringing it back to their truth, which is to always put the consumer at the front of everything. So I think for me, it's less about, okay, create specifically for each format. Yes, you should definitely make sure that you tell a story with your channels, but it's more about making sure that your brand truth is consistent across all of your channels to land the message that you're trying to create.
What it also reminds me of is very much these out of home experiences, right? So it's not just, we've been talking a lot about your out of home ad, your static ad, or your out of home environment, it triggers the intent for search, etc. But what we haven't touched on is very much these consumer experiences that are driven through out of home. So we spoke about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola did the karaoke billboard, which was a billboard that turned into a karaoke machine. Then we've also had like a Meta Quest 3, which is one of my favorites, which is, it looked like a billboard frame, and we'll obviously link it, but you actually stepped into it and it actually became this whole world. So you look like you're stepping into a billboard on the side of the road, and inside was this room with virtual experiences and obviously other experiences linked to that launch of MetaQuest 3, I think it was. But like these types of experiences where it's not just a flat 2D static billboard or just a build on a billboard, it's actually something that you're actually experiencing. The Survivor billboard by JC Decaux and DSTV, like that was incredible. Where they had people actually on those boards, standing on the board and doing Survivor challenges. But this is where social amplification and digital media is like, it's a no-brainer. If you're doing any out-of-home experiences and you don't want it to just be experienced in an isolated, space or location or mall or whatever it might be, you wanting to amplify that, you wanting that story and that experience to go across onto digital and social channels. And this is where it's obviously exceptionally important. And I mean, these campaigns where I've seen, some of them I never even got to see in person. I've just got to see them online, and I've been like, wow, this is incredible. But it was actually a billboard, that had been changed into this experience.
100%. I think that sensory experience that out of home can drive is so impactful, especially when you look at what's available in a mall, for example. I think we need to change how we're viewing what out of home can do and what is the experience that it creates for a digital consumer. I think digital consumers are getting to the point where everything looks the same. Sometimes the brands blur because if a new format is released, everyone's hopping on it. If a new reel comes out, everyone's jumping on it. If there's a new TikTok trend, everybody jumps on it. But the distinction that out of home helps you create is something that lands with a consumer for a longer period of time than a TikTok challenge.
I wanted to ask you, Niv, for out of home media owners that are being told by clients or even agency people that are being told from their clients, out of home is not on the media plan. We're doing a digital media first approach, or all our spend's mandated to go to digital media, or we're focusing on digital media only this year. What would your advice be to these media owners or to these agency staff that are trying to navigate these types of conversations with clients and how they can get out of home back to be considered or back onto the media plan? What would your advice be to them from a sales strategy point of view in these types of scenarios and situations that are currently happening?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I always say take it back to the commercial impact that you can drive from something, right? So I think when we think out of home, we think reach and frequency only, right? The new way of looking at it is how does digital help me drive downstream digital outcomes? And there's a lot of different ways that you can start then unpacking that and slicing and dicing it. So for me personally, I would say take it back to multi-mix modeling, right? Or multi-touch attribution, because everything has a role to play. So if you had to think about a Google ecosystem, for example, there's different attribution models that you can use to test last click, first click. there's so many different ways of looking at it, right? But when you start looking at a hybrid model of measurement and you stop looking at it from a channel perspective and you start being more channel agnostic and thinking about what is the long term impact behind something, that commercial value starts showing a lot stronger. Also, go back to the search analysis. I think search analysis is always the first step. And there's a lot of free tools that can be used to do keyword research, help you see that intent. Just lean into the levers that already exist within an organization. A lot of big clients already have social listening in place. It's just about tapping in and being sure about what it is you're measuring. What's the conversation trigger that you want to focus on to show that there was an impact? Um, and then take it back to that geo-targeted space versus a controlled environment and see what can be done there. I think a lot of the time we really take for granted the amount of data that we have. From an out-of-home perspective, there's a lot of footfall and mobility data that exists, which brands can then overlay with their first-party data to see what the impact their brands are having in particular areas. And once you start getting to that like nuts and bolts level, you can then start driving a lot more incremental testing. And the more you test, the more you see behaviors and patterns in the data that you have. But I think the one key thing is stop measuring out of home at a holding level and start looking at the granular impact that it has within specific vicinities and see how that drives a difference to your commercial strategy.
I think there's a huge opportunity for this to happen more so when it comes to the, person that's handling the out of home media, that's building these holdings, that's building these campaigns, and the person who can actually get these digital reports and this information, and you actually start using that in your reporting and in your analysis on what is the actual outcomes of how this out of home is creating this action, this search intent, this, whatever this might be, or attributing, as you said, these multi-touch point attributions. How is it attributing to the actions that's happening down the funnel on digital media, right?
As we head towards our close, what would you love to see the out of home channel doing by bridging this gap with digital? What would you like to see, in the future? Campaigns that, what elements would they include, or what innovations are you looking forward to seeing in the market where we are bringing this online and offline worlds together?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think for me, I'm going to go back to the incremental testing, right? Do stuff with out of home and do stuff without it. It's the easiest way for you to be able to understand what works and what doesn't work in a controlled environment and then in different space, I think the big thing is that we think cost cutting gets rid of attribution biases, but it doesn't, because the attribution bias is still there, whether you cut costs or not. I think the way to truly measure this and see a business impact is to do incremental testing, because then it will tell you what actually moves the needle. So if you have to do experiential marketing on one campaign, do a campaign without experiential marketing and look at the impact that it has on your sales numbers. Once you have that analysis against two similar base products, it's easier for you to say what works or doesn't work. I think a lot of brands hone in on it has to beat everything else that's in the market. I think a lot of the time, if I think back to how when Cus and I worked together, it was about how do we do something that stands out so completely against our competitors. And we would constantly be looking for these new ways, but it only lasts for a short period of time, right? Whereas if you're testing and learning, you're continuously iterating what you know and becoming better at something. So I think that's where I would say play in that space, incrementally test stuff.
Niv, thank you so much for being with us. It's been amazing to sit down with you. We've had so many different directions of conversations, the reporting, the measurement, the campaign inspiration. There really was so much to uncover in this episode, and we could definitely have a part two to double click on a lot of the things that we touched on. But it was really great just to have the opinions and advice from a digital expert on the podcast with us today. So thank you so much.
Pleasure, ladies. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to the sponsor of today's episode. Your support helps make Beyond the Billboard possible and helps us to bring you the first and only out-of-home podcast in South Africa.
Thanks for joining us today to go beyond the billboard. Subscribe to our podcast to ensure you don't miss out on our exciting content.
Join us again to go beyond the billboard.
1, 2,